Now, I would like to present Professor William Roberts. He is Executive Director in Baylor Heart and Vascular Institute in Baylor University Medical Center in USA. He is Editor-in-Chief in Baylor University Medical Center Proceedings, and he is Editor-in-Chief the American Journal of Cardiology. Please welcome Professor William Roberts to give his speech and his lecture.
In Africa by some of the British physicians there before World War II. And these individuals, and wait a minute, pointed out that so many of the diseases seen in the Western world were not seen in Africa, including atherosclerosis, high blood pressure, stroke, deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, phlebitis, varicose veins, some gastrointestinal conditions, constipations, appendicitis, diverticular disease, colorectal polyps, certain cancers, hemorrhoids, hiatal hernia, and then, of course, metabolic syndrome, obesity, diabetes type 2, cholesterol, gallstones, renal stones, osteoporosis, even gout. And then some of our most common cancers, colorectal, breast, prostate, and then dental caries and periodontal disease. The first thought was by Dr. Cleve and Campbell that the lack of that the Western diseases were caused by people in the Western world eating refined carbohydrates and having the fiber really very low in the diet. But overconsumption of sugar, white flour was, in these people's view, the main cause of these most common diseases in the Western world. The removal of fiber led to the dental caries, etc., and the various gastrointestinal diseases. Removal of protein, well, that didn't prove to be quite proper, but at least that was the first thought. The second idea came from Dennis Burkitt and the men he worked with. It was the lack of fiber in the diet. And Dennis Burkitt, the famous general surgeon whose tumor is called the Burkitt tumor, was also the one who pointed out the lack of fiber in the Western world and the great presence thereof in Africa and certain other areas. Cleve and Campbell wrote this: African Americans who eat the same refined carbohydrates as the European Americans, whereas those living tribally in Africa subsist on a diet almost wholly composed of crudely ground maize, corn, that is, unrefined carbohydrates. The very large quantity of fiber ingested by the tribal Africans has a striking effect on the quantity and the quality of the stools. These are passed twice a day and are extended like a ribbon of toothpaste, some 15 inches long and of the diameter of the middle finger. They are, in fact, known locally as the toothpaste stool. Now, these are some contrasts of three diseases in the Zulus in certain part of South Africa before World War II or not long thereafter, and in the National Health Service hospitals in UK. Appendicitis frequency among the hospital admissions, 38,047, a very low frequency, whereas in the National Health Service hospitals, relatively high. Cholecystitis and gallstones, extremely low, much, much higher. Diverticulitis, virtually zero, much, much higher. These are societies around the world. It extended out from Africa, of course, where atherosclerosis is virtually non-existent. And all of these societies have total cholesterols essentially less than 150 milligrams per deciliter. In Africa, there are a number of these people that have been fairly well studied. In Georgia, the former Soviet Union, the Alpacasians, the Caucasians, mountainous people, a very low frequency of these Western diseases. Same with the Vilcabambas in Ecuador, the Hunzas in Pakistan, the rural Okinawans of Japan, and the rural Chinese. And all of these populations have been quite well studied. This is a book by Grace Halsell, who lived with the Alcamambans in Ecuador for some time and wrote a great deal about them. Here's another book by Hoffman about the Hunzas in Pakistan. Sula Bennett wrote about the people in one of these other areas. So their lifestyle, they're all living in mountainous areas, and they seem to be happy. They work all their lives. Their last 30 years of life is not spent with chronic diseases. They're moving around all the time. They eat local foods. These are the traditional diets of these long-lived cultures, and they're remarkably similar. The Abkhazians, the Vilcabambas, and the Hunzans, the calories from carbohydrates, very high. Calories from fat, relatively lower. Protein, relatively low. Overall daily calories, about 1900. Diet from plant foods, extremely high. Diet from animal foods, extremely low. Salt consumption, very low. Sugar, processed food, zero. Obesity, zero. This is a book about the Okinawa program. These people have been documented to live longer than anybody else in the world. Probably in some of these other societies there were similarly old age people, but their documented births were not well done. More 100-year-olds in Okinawa than anywhere in the world. What do they eat there compared to the USA? These are the rural Okinawans. It's changing a bit now, of course. Meat, poultry, and eggs, very low compared to the USA. Dairy products, very low. Fruit, surprisingly, not so much. Vegetables, very high. Grains, very high. Soy foods, very high. Fish, pretty good. Much different than in the USA, an example of the Western world. Well, the studies in rural China, in the last 20 years have been quite extensive. The diet in these rural Chinese compared to the U.S., quite different. A lot of calories, they're working a lot, moving around. Total fat, 15%, USA, 36%, devastating. Total protein, much higher in the U.S. Animal protein, very low here, very high here. Dietary fiber, very low U.S., very high rural China. Iron, also a bit different. Colin Campbell and others there in China, the ones who have studied these people extensively, they divide the diseases into those of affluence, namely the Western world and now your world, and diseases of poverty. The diseases of affluence, cancer of the colon, breast, lung, etc., diabetes, atherosclerosis. These are the diseases that mean progress. These are the diseases that come with money. The more the money, the more of these diseases. Diseases of poverty, quite different, of course, quite sad. Pneumonia, intestinal obstruction, rheumatic heart disease, parasitic disease, tuberculosis, etc. Dr. Campbell wrote this from those conclusions of the Chinese studies. Atherosclerosis can be reversed with diet alone. Diabetic medications can be eliminated by dietary change. Type 1 diabetes is linked to infant